The tribe has grown. Wow. Yeah, no, this is my favorite event of the year, and it's a tremendous honor to be able to speak to you today. So I wanted to talk to you about a trend that Patrick had highlighted earlier at the beginning, big data. We've heard an astonishingly stimulating summary from Kalev. I can't possibly match all of these amazing statistics, but I wanted to talk about what this means, I think, for this community, certainly for the work that we're doing at the UN and Global Pulse. I'll talk some about the work we're doing on and off in Global Pulse, but I primarily want to sort of share some observations, challenges that we've encountered along the way, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the current work we're doing in Indonesia, a really interesting place to look at big data, and then think a bit about the future. This is a very loose taxonomy. This is not a formal taxonomy, but I think there's been a lot of data in the crisis mapping community for some time. The traditional data sets, official statistics, the survey data out there, the historical data, the kinds of maps that you can create of who's doing what where. This is essentially a lot of information that you actively go out and collect. What people share when they're asked to share. What's changing now, of course, is we have numbers 3 and 4. We have the ability to observe in real time on a massive scale with a lot of machine intelligence what people are already sharing with one another all day long as they go about their daily lives. And of course, perhaps even more transformative, the next revolution is the data that people generate just by using services around the world. As we think about what happens when people use these services, they interact with each other socially through, social networks. They transact business. Look at all of the information that's being created in East Africa through mobile money services, for example. The private sector has spent, trillions of dollars building the cloud. And now these services are available as human sensor networks because every time people's needs change, they change how they use these services. So we think data exhaust is really the area where we're going to see the biggest transformations in this work, the ability to passively observe what's happening in terms of collective human behavior in real time. The context, this is not the world in which the United Nations certainly was founded. This is a very different world indeed. The Industrial Revolution has connected us through transportation networks, and now with telephony, internet connectivity, and more recently with the social media revolution, everything moves faster now. The pace of change has absolutely exploded, and I don't think we're ever going to see it slow down. And when everything happens in real time, as we're learning, and in some cases learning the hard way, real time isn't just faster, it's fundamentally different. It requires a different set of rules. So how do we adapt to a real-time world? Touching on Kalev's point, 2011 is a pretty significant year because there was more data created in 2011 than in all the rest of human history combined, back to the invention of the Phoenician alphabet. This isn't about the volume of data, it's about the speed at which the volume of data is increasing. This is taking off. Nobody's ready for it. Facebook hit 1 billion people last week. Twitter, of course, at 400 million. If you do the math, that's 4,600 tweets per second. That's a lot of tweets. Let's put that for those of us who haven't entirely migrated to the paperless office. If you were to print these tweets at 7 terabytes worth of tweets, that's 120,000 four-drawer file cabinets every day. If these were countries, those are the top 6 largest countries in the world. So mobiles create a lot of data. If you have people using mobile phones, and all over the developing world, people are using mobile phones, you're creating huge amounts of useful data right there. Mobiles plus cloud services, and access to cloud services over SMS absolutely counts. You're creating more data. As soon as you bring social, you're getting incredible amounts of data. This is a map of tweets in Jakarta. Right? Jakarta now produces, by some estimates, 9 million tweets a day. Jakarta is the tweetingest city on Earth. Indonesians, as you can tell, spend a lot of time stuck in traffic. You can almost drive by that map, and they're tweeting. And it's interesting, you know, there's some very unique characteristics of every culture and how they use these tools that you have to understand through the same ethnographic lens. You would understand how any culture has any practice. And I think it's interesting, an Indonesian apparently is 11 times more likely than any other nationality to share a digital photo. Surely there's some way we can leverage that for reporting purposes. When we ask the Indonesians, what's up with you guys in photos, they say we're very vain, actually. We just like taking pictures of ourselves. But reasons aside, it's an interesting question, what could be done there? So we see in big data 3 distinct types of opportunities. One, of course, better early warning. Detect the trends, detect the anomalies, detect the events sooner, respond sooner, save lives, conserve resources. Secondly, real-time awareness. If we can use this data to give us a higher resolution or a more up-to-date picture of reality, we can plan, we can implement more effectively. And third, perhaps most importantly, is real-time feedback. If we can use this information, these real-time feedback loops, to stay on top of a dynamic landscape, or to recognize when what we're doing isn't working so that we can take corrective action, this is going to allow us to adopt a much more agile approach to everything we do. Definition of terms, dangerous, but let's define real-time here. Real-time, for us at Global Pulse certainly, has a very applied sense. We think about real-time as the information that still accurately reflects the phenomenon you care about sufficiently well that you can use it to change the outcome. And in other words, it's relative to context. If you're talking about malnutrition, your data can't be more than a couple of months old. If you're talking about starvation, weeks, cholera, days, people trapped in the rubble after an earthquake, you have hours. So we think there are a lot of areas to explore from a research standpoint. Disaster preparedness. We've been in negotiations and discussions with mobile carriers around the world about getting access to anonymized call-to-tail records. This is a very interesting kind of data set because it can tell you, among other things, population movement over time. One idea we had was, could we, for example, take a population that had been impacted by multiple natural hazard events at some point in which they received training, they met as a community, they decided upon a formal evacuation plan. Could we do a correlation analysis to show that, in fact, after the training was delivered, they were able to organize more effectively? Can we see population movement in real time to estimate how much resilience we're creating? Population migration, an interesting area. Can we see intent to migrate through online search, through what people say on social media? Can we see devices that were purchased in one area showing up in another? We're in discussions now in Indonesia with an organization that's interested in using mobile phone call-to-tail records, again, to predict where malaria is going to end up, because you can see people moving from malarious areas to other areas. Urbanization. This is the way the world is going. We do not have a handle on it. We do not understand urban poverty. We do not understand the vulnerabilities of these populations. And yet, by some estimates, by 2050, half of the human race will live in urban slums. What does that mean? How can we render this legible? Food security monitoring. There's another food crisis coming, of course, one after the other. People talk about food prices online. They post food prices online. We can see transaction patterns in data. How can we use this information? Climate change adaptation, conflict, election monitoring. There are a number of areas. The two at the end I've highlighted. The first, M&E. Right? This is a really interesting area, and it gets back to these feedback loops. As we've begun to have conversations with organizations across a whole range of sectors, this keeps coming back up again. Can we get faster feedback on whether our programs and policy initiatives are actually having the desired effect, as opposed to using 3-year-old data to make a 5-year plan and then measuring it at the end and finding out it didn't work? There's a lot of interest in that area. And finally, can we use some of these techniques to approximate statistics? There's some very interesting work we saw out of the mobile carrier Telefonica, where they were able to basically build predictive models of socioeconomic level and gender and age group from how people use their phones using anonymous data. From that, they have then been able to project for an entire country in Latin America about 80% accurate figures for those indicators by only doing samples every year in 5 provinces. So there may be some interesting techniques there as well. This is the kind of project we're thinking about, really taking something with big data and applying it in a very concrete way. I think concrete means you built something that somebody else can use. So as we heard earlier, the drought in the Sahel hits in 2011. There's not a lot of action taken until 2012. So we wondered, would it be possible to use call-to-tail records, airtime purchases, these kinds of anonymized data sets, and do a correlation analysis for the entire period of the onset of the drought and the response against rainfall levels? When the rains don't come, what changes in population movement? What changes in communications behavior? What changes in people's purchasing? Do you see people who normally spend $7 a month on their phones shifting to $2? Can we see the economic impact of the drought? Can we see the resulting migration? So we're in discussions now with Orange and World Food Programme in Senegal about the idea of looking at these call-to-tail records. If it works, the next step would be to build an open source appliance that could potentially be plugged into any mobile phone carrier's network in the world to emit these kind of indicators in real time. I know GSMA is in the room. Perhaps we could have a discussion about whether there might be a partnership there someday, but only if it works. It's part of the experimental nature of this. I wanted to chat a bit about the challenges. There are many. As has been noted, big data is really just data. There's a lot of it, but it has a lot of challenges around privacy, around validation, around access to some of the more interesting kinds of data. And of course, does it actually change anything? So what if you can deliver real-time information if the organization responsible for responding doesn't act? And here's where we start. Big data, people think of big data, they think of the Target story. They think of privacy, and they should, of course. When you talk about data privacy, you're talking about the risk of re-identification by connecting data sets. But if you're in the UN, you think of re-identification, you think human rights issue. Right? Big data is probably the single biggest human rights issue ever, and it's only getting bigger. But the problem from our perspective is that we see big data, in addition to being a source of tremendous risk, as a raw public good. The challenge is, how do you create a space within which we can experiment with it and learn how we can use this data while also protecting privacy? Right now, you might characterize the big data privacy debate as somewhat polarized. It's sort of Mark Zuckerberg versus Germany, right? It's, privacy is dead and profit is king versus reuse is forbidden. We're trying to say, actually, no, it's a public good, but we need a space to try out new approaches. We've been working on a draft set of guidelines on how to use this data safely that we can use in all of the labs that we're opening. We've been sharing it increasingly with privacy experts and technologists out there. If you're interested in taking a look We'd love to talk to you about it, let you take a look, and hopefully next year we can hold an event on this. Again, huge potential, but huge risks. We need to get this right, and we need to go overboard on transparency. Dealing with user-generated data, messy stuff. People lie. We see the map of tweets in Jakarta again. There's some bright blue areas, and there are dark areas. Do the dark areas contain nothing worth tweeting about? No. Your sensor network is unevenly distributed, so there's bias built into this data from the start. People are on the roads. Perception versus fact. Google's flu trends doesn't actually catch flu. It catches influenza-like illness, anything with the symptoms of flu. That turns out to actually be good enough, for the most part, to catch flu, but one has to know the difference. The natural language processing tools out there don't really do well with sentiment analysis in areas like sarcasm, irony. 140 character text message can contain, who knows, gigabytes of context. They're instantly apparent to a human with a brain with 100 billion neurons, but not so much to one of these algorithms yet. So that's difficult. Context is tough. And then there's the fact that people say one thing and have no intention of actually doing it and do another. Behavioral data, all of this data has selection bias in it. Many different types, including what phone company you have that's getting where the data is coming from. We have feedback loops, some of which are helpful and some of which are not always helpful. The media, of course, change behavior. As soon as someone says there's a flu outbreak, more people go online and search for symptoms. And then we have this wonderful word, apophenia. It's the tendency to believe that you're seeing meaningful patterns in what is actually meaningless data. Correlation is not causality. On the left, we see about a 0.7 correlation with people searching for maximum wind speed and hurricanes in the Atlantic. That actually is probably quite a valid correlation. On the right, people looking at weight gain and apartments for rent. What's the relationship? Time of year, after the holidays. No correlation. There's no causal relationship there. These mistakes are easy to make. But it's just data. News organizations are finding ways to validate it. There are cases when perceptual data is exactly what you're looking for. If you have a population that believes that something is the best way to treat HIV is to go see a shaman, you want to catch that, as false as that perception may be. And sometimes selection bias is an advantage. We saw an example where we were mining online food prices with price stats. And interestingly, the people who advertise online know that the populations who buy these products are very wealthy in developing countries. Anyone who's looking online probably has a pretty good income in a developing country. But it turns out that actually, because the vendors who sell to those populations know this, they raise the online prices 2 to 4 weeks before the offline prices go up. So you actually get prediction out of it. Sophia is here, who's working with a Twitter earthquake detector at USGS. This gets at the challenge of how can an institution adopt these new data sources, right? You're dealing with always trade-offs between speed and accuracy. It's the old business adage, you can have fast, cheap, or good. You can have any two. I think this is an interesting example because the point here, they've got the system so that it can now detect earthquakes in multiple languages by what people say on Twitter with less than a 10% false positive rate. But what's interesting is how they use that data. They're not immediately declaring an earthquake when the signal comes in, though it did a spectacular job recently in the Philippines. What they're doing, in this case, is they're able to wake up the seismologist in that part of the world. and say, go check your sensor data right now, which reduces the time to pinpoint the epicenter down from 20 minutes to 3 or 4 or 5. So again, this is complementary data. It's not a replacement for the techniques and the hard evidence we currently use to make decisions. But it's about knowing how the speed can change the outcome. Of course, all big data projects, right? We're building macroscopes. An analogy here, if we, the astrophysicists tell us if we look out through a telescope at the universe, 70-something percent, 74% of what's out there is dark energy, 22% is dark matter, and we have a measly 4% that is the universe we know and recognize and thought until about 20 years ago was there. The problem is the dark bits don't reflect light, so we can't see them. We think there's an analogy to the world of big data, because while there's an immense amount of information out there publicly available, some of the best, most valuable data sources that could be used to tell us in real time what's happening to populations are being collected behind corporate firewalls. And they're not visible, and they're not being shared, which means they can't be used to strengthen public policy. What does it mean when what would you estimate, 90-something% of the information about people is not available to those who are supposed to represent people and make sure the healthcare systems and the education systems are working? It's a problem. We've been engaging these companies, as many of you know, for some time, many companies with very interesting data sets, mobile carriers, financial institutions, companies that provide digital services, around this concept of data philanthropy. Is there a way for them to share some of the data that powers business in a way that doesn't prevent their, doesn't compromise their competitiveness or anyone's privacy in the process? But what does that actually lead to? This isn't really just about corporate social responsibility, right? Think longer term here. If we can get the private sector to engage in sharing some of this data in a way that does not create business risk for them, I can say from the conversations we've had, companies, especially those that work in emerging markets, recognize that this hyper-connected and volatile and uncertain world we live in is a terrible business environment. And if it's possible for some of the information that they have to be used to respond quicker when populations who are also their present or future customers are in trouble, that's actually a way to mitigate business risk. But there are huge questions here. What data can be shared? What data can't be shared but could be analyzed behind firewalls and the analysis shared? What models could be out there for pooling data? We think industry trade associations could be very valuable clearinghouses for collecting data from across different members of the industry and stripping out the company name so no one knows whose customers those are in ways that could provide very useful data sets for analysis. What are the tools? What are the technologies? What kinds of architectures are we going to need for this kind of approach? But we think a data commons is really the only way we're going to survive as a species for the next 100 years, because this is the information we need to understand what's happening to our whole species in real time. We're taking a lab-based approach to this, of course, and I think the point here is that this is very early days. We need to create safe space for experimentation. We need to try lots of things in a sandbox environment. They aren't all going to work. Many will not. We've just launched Pulse Lab Jakarta in partnership with the government of Indonesia, working with the Ministry of Planning and others on October 1st. And Pulse Lab Jakarta is a shared facility with data scientists and engineers and policy experts, research fellows, volunteers from the private sector, partnering with companies who have cutting-edge tools, who have data to share, who have analytical expertise. And we're just starting now really to define the research agenda for the next 2 years. Based on some existing and previous work, we're looking for partners who are interested in trying out some of these new approaches in one of the most social media-rich countries in the world. The idea is to open a few labs enough to get a regional sense of what the data sources are. Indonesia, lots of social media. The next lab to be open early next year, Pulse Lab Kampala. In East Africa, not as much social media, but mobile financial services are an extraordinary phenomenon there, and we think there's a huge opportunity. Other locations to be determined. This is all about partnerships. For any of us to do this work, we're going to have to pair up and work with partners all across this ecosystem. You know, there's huge opportunities to build on the work that the private sector has already done. Right? All of the engineering and analytical expertise that has gone into figuring out how to tell when teenage girls like your project, like your product, like your service. Right? We can take those same analytical techniques and understand when communities are in trouble, when our messages are reaching them or they aren't. Lots of tools out there. We're again looking for partners who can help us with this entire endeavor because as the UN, we're a platform. We can't do this alone. So here's the methodology we're following, which we hope could be a model for many organizations around the world. Partner, build a team, right? Bring in the private sector expertise to work with public sector, conduct these experiments. Where we find something useful, often from looking at historical data, turn it into an open source tool that can be used by anybody and share what you learn. We've been looking at urbanization and these very fast-growing urban areas in Indonesia, changes in social welfare. What conversation do we see about people talking about food prices, about fuel prices, about losing their jobs? What conversation in social media do we see about where people are talking about the programs that government has implemented or bolstered as food prices and fuel prices have risen to provide assistance? Are they working? What experiences have people had? Youth unemployment, migration to cities. We're looking at a number of different approaches here. That should say price scraping, not price scaping. The basic approach, use keywords to go out and find out, how much content is there in these different data sources. From research last year, for example, we found that Twitter is great for people reporting prices. It is useless for understanding, for example, when people are afraid they're going to lose their jobs or to understand how job loss has affected people. And the reason is the temporal horizon. Twitter is ephemeral. It's all about the here and now. You need to understand, for a given data source, what types of conversation can you find? Then we're applying different analytical methodologies. So we find a certain number of documents that vary over time that match certain criteria according to the keywords and phrases. Next, we look at sentiment around these topics. And then at mood state, can we see changes in anxiety, anger, depression, happiness, fear? And finally, go back looking at multiple years of historical data and these trends and do correlation analysis against a ground truth curve of statistical time series data. Let's look at comparing what we see to the actual food prices and fuel prices. Can be patterns in migration, can be unemployment rates, whatever it be, and then visualize the results. We're trying to find proxy indicators in this data. One of the tools we work with is Crimson Hexagon's platform, Foresight, looking at conversations with these keywords. You can see that there was pretty good evidence that the global soybean shortage had a direct impact upon the Indonesian population. Lots of conversation about tofu and tempeh really taking off. These are major sources of protein in Indonesia, and you can see sort of the timeline for this. Last year we did a study where we found that if you simply count the number of tweets over time, basically you do see that food-related tweets increase right after Ramadan. There's a bit of a spike. So Indonesians tweet a lot about food, and they tweet differently when they're not eating. But compare the Ramadan spike to the tofu and tempeh crisis. But there's your baseline. Your baseline, yeah, there's always a blip. But this was a massive, massive explosion of fear. Interestingly, we found when we compared the fuel crisis in April with the July soybean crisis, the number of food-related tweets was the same in both. People understand that when fuel prices go up, they're not going to be able to afford food. So the anxiety was similar. We also work with SAS's social media analytics platform, looking at many of the same signals. Basically, there are over 200,000 Indonesian social media documents created every day. So going in, pulling these in, extracting the conversation, doing these types of scoring and classification, and then looking for correlations. In many cases, you can map this data, so getting a sense of where some of the strongest signals are coming from. Lots of tweets coming from Java. We started developing, and this is very early work, we're all about maximum transparency, very early work, but we've begun to see some evidence that by looking at certain conversations, we have the ability to mine social media for a real-time or even possible predictive proxy for consumer price inflation in food. Right? In other words, those conversations may actually allow us to predict the official statistics for food that are only available at the end of the month. What's interesting, though, is eggs. Let's chat about eggs. Eggs is actually negative. So what's up with Indonesian and eggs? We looked at this and we said, this doesn't make sense. You know, our hypothesis was that as food prices went up, people would be tweeting more and more about the fact that they can't afford eggs. Right? That makes sense. That would be a stress signal. We've seen those kinds of signals in other countries and other contexts. But Indonesians actually, the more they're tweeting about eggs, the lower the prices are. I have to go dig into the data. When we get into the data, about 10% of the tweets are Indonesians saying, egg prices are going up, I'm really worried. But the other 90 are basically Indonesians saying, yum, I just had the best omelet. Now, does that work in all parts of Indonesia? Does it work in Bali? Does it work in the Philippines? No idea. But I think the point here is that there's a deeply ethnographic dimension to this data. We've all heard the kind of anecdotal stories of, northern Uganda when, you see people selling their bicycles, they're buying AK-47s. Does that work in every part of Uganda? Who knows? I mean, the point, I think, here is to say that one day, one of the longer-term products of all of the work that we're doing is going to have to include maps of the changes that occur in the digital realm and what they actually mean in the offline world. And those are going to vary both in space and from one population intermixed with another population. We need to understand what these signals mean. In Indonesia, more tweets about eggs can be a good thing. The signals are getting stronger. We've seen that people are using social media to talk about basic needs in a way that they hadn't been before. At the beginning of the year, we see this incredible explosion in use of social media in Indonesia to talk about basic needs. What does that mean? Well, when we compared the rough index that we were able to derive by looking at mood states and keyword volumes over time for food prices, if we tried to do this 2 years ago, the experiment would have failed. But you see the curves start to track around the time that you see the volume of social media conversation around basic needs increasing. The point here is that just like we're now seeing amazing discussions in the States here about the elections, people change how they use these tools, right? The internet was used only for lolcats for a while. Now it's actually used in many useful ways. These tools are changing. These are dynamic landscapes, and in every country we're going to see a point where these take off. Next sets of data, we've been offered, for example, a year of anonymized call-to-tail records in Indonesia from 4 of the largest carriers. Lots of data. And to wrap up, If we're able to move toward a real-time data commons, if we're able to develop the methodologies that help us understand what patterns correspond to what changes in well-being offline, if we're able to foster an ecosystem that produces a wealth of freely available tools and services that anyone can use to understand this data. I live in New York. I can go to any of 100 websites and type in my zip code, and I can get 3 things. I can get real-time sensor information, airspeed, temperature, cloud cover. I can get the results of that real-time information being fed into predictive models that are constantly updated, that can tell me 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 days out with decreasing confidence what's likely to happen. And finally, I'm able to benefit from algorithmic anomaly detectors that look for example, swirling cloud patterns and automatically alert me. Could we move toward the equivalent of these kinds of socioeconomic or other sectoral weather stations? Can we get to the point that you could look at a community and instantly be able to understand what the trends are right then and there, where they seem to be heading, and get alerted if patterns start to appear? I think there's an analogy here. So I think that where we are right now is that, this community is at an inflection point, and this data is everywhere, and the tools are absolutely taking off. And we would be very glad to work with you, and very excited about where this is going. And I can't imagine what 2013 ICCM is going to look like. Thank you very much.